unless anyone here has any substantive changes to make.
I'll second.
Okay, great. Minutes are approved. Thank you. I don't have much to say by way of opening. I'm looking around to see if we have the majority of our board here, and I believe we do. We certainly have a quorum. And I think we mostly have faces who joined us at our first meeting, although that may not be fully true. Shanice, I don't think you joined us. So for the sake of time, I think rather than all of us going around and doing introductions, since we do only have an hour and I think have a lot of content to get through, Shanice, I wonder if at least since you weren't with us for our first meeting, you might just want to introduce yourself and let the group here know who you are and what you do at PPS. And then I think, again, for the sake of just making sure that we get to kind of the meatier issues on our agenda, I'll recommend that we just go ahead and dive in.
Sure. Really quick, my name is Shanice Clark, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm the Director of Community Engagement and supporting this good budget team as well as the CVRC along your journey. So I'll let you all get started and we'll help take notes for today.
Great. Thanks, Janice. You've been a great partner to us in so many ways. So we are happy to have you here tonight. I think without further ado, unless any of my co-chairs have any sort of welcoming remarks, thoughts, things that you'd like to say to the group, I'm going to suggest we turn things over to Claire and Nicole and go from there. I'm just seeing the chat. Is there a connectivity issue that we need to address?
It's background noise.
Great. So good reminder to try and follow norms and keep yourself muted if you aren't speaking. I'm pleased to say that the background noise was not my children for once in this moment as I was unmuted, but it's usually me. So Nicole, I'm seeing raising your hand. I totally get it.
It was mine, probably. I'm not going
to lie. Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and turn things over to you, Claire and Nicole, and we really appreciate you taking time to give us the latest, both as it relates to what we're hearing from Salem and I think the implications on the PPS budget forecast. So thanks so much.
So I'm Claire Hertz, and I know that I haven't met some of the newer members, Deputy Superintendent of Business and Operations, and now that Cynthia Lay has retired, I'm going to step in and support Nicole until we have our new CFO in place. And so I do welcome all of you that are new, and I look forward to meeting you in person someday in the future. And going forward, we have too many slides to get through to do this all so that you can finish your meeting in an hour. So I'm going to skip ahead to some of the pieces that are important. And then if there are questions, what I really want to do is leave some time for questions. Okay. And
Claire, you might point out that the board received this briefing last night, and so you could view the entire presentation at pps.net.
Yes, it for sure. You could see it on YouTube. We had over an hour discussion with the board last night. And so I'm going to skip past the budget process, and hopefully that's something that you guys can have, kind of talked about previously. So here, this is probably the meat of what you're looking for. In the governor's budget, there's some assumptions, and one is that we have a $9.1 billion funding level across the state for the biennium. So that would be for the next 2 years, 2021 to 2023. And there is also, they incorporate an overall average of 6% PERS savings for the biennium. And across the state, it would equate to $600 million. There is an issue that PERS, because we did bonds and financed our PERS debt earlier, we realized savings earlier, namely over 15 years ago, and then realized those savings for a long time. And so we are not the current service level calculation at the state is a little problematic for us because we're receiving a little over 1% over the biennium for additional state school fund. And as you know, it usually runs closer to about 4% a year. So here are our revenue assumptions, and you can kind of see, if you look, there's 2 years of history, 1819 and 1920, and then the current year. You can see that we were at 5 and 4, percent, and you can see for the next 2 years it's about a 0.5% increase. So that causes a shortfall for us in the state school fund. And then we're anticipating, based on the state economists' forecast, that we would return in the 23-24 year to a more reasonable allocation of resources. In this, you can see that we do have some dips in enrollment. Those were projected even before COVID hit, that our enrollment was going to be in a slight decline in some future years. Let's see. You can also see that the local option levy is continuing to grow over that time. We're recognizing about a 3% growth rate, and that's what it has been most recently in 1920, and then what we anticipate for 2021. Here are our expenditure assumptions, and you can see this. I just have to say, this is really hard to present when I can't see anyone's faces when I'm presenting, and I can't tell if people are understanding what I'm saying. So please feel free to ask me a question as I'm going through this, okay? And so you can see that here we have salary increases, and historically 3%, and then we go to 4 in this year anticipated, and then we've carried that forward into the future years. Our PERS rate, you can see we used to be at 2.8, went up to 4.8, and we're expecting 4.11. So we're not realizing a 6% savings. We're realizing about a 0.5% savings. So that's where some of the issues come in terms of current service level from the state level being a shortfall for Portland Public. We are not alone. There are other districts that are in the same, especially some of the larger districts across the state are experiencing the same conditions or current service level issues. You can see our payroll costs going across, staying pretty stable in terms of benefit costs, but then the health insurance, you can see we're projecting 5% over in the future as based on historical trends. And then our charter schools will increase based on our state school fund increase. So pretty much that is most of the large expenses in our general fund. I want to share with you, these were some variable.
Claire, can I interrupt for a second? I don't know if now is the right time, but maybe it is. I just wanted to call out, I'm trying to monitor the chat because I'm not sure if you can see that on your screen. So Roger, is it okay if I voice your question quickly for Claire? Or did you want to jump in? Okay, I'm going to
go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So from Roger, he's a reminder to all of us that Congress is busy working on some sort of relief package and seems to be near agreement. News reports that state local government are not included. Is that your understanding? Governor Brown has called a special session on Monday. Do we know what the state is proposing?
That was in the board meeting last night, and I don't know that there's much dollars there for education, but we're still holding a placeholder there. There's things for landlord-tenant relief. There's, I don't have the list in front of me, and it's hard for me to present and go to it. So, but there are some very specific items. One thing that will help us is she's doing a limited liability for COVID for education, meaning that as long as we have our health and safety measures in place, that they're limiting K-12's liability for COVID. So that will be an important component of allowing us to open. So that will have a positive impact on our reentry plans to reopen schools.
Great, thanks.
Claire, would you like me to present since Shanice is taking notes? Will that be more helpful?
That would be great, because then I could
Yeah.
actually see the chat. So do you have that up somewhere? Here, I'll stop sharing. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So these were some variables that the board asked us to cost out. So for instance, we talked about enrollment we lost about 3% of our enrollment this year, especially in the early primary grades. And so in 22-23, we estimated half of them would come back at the start of school, and they wanted to know if they all came back because of the vaccine, it would be an additional $4 million. So that's an example of something they asked us to cost out. But you have those pieces in case as you're looking at various scenarios. Next slides, please. So here is, in 2021, we started our beginning fund balance at 64 million. We worked hard last year to save an additional fund balance, got up to 9%, which is well above the goals that had been set previously. And our total revenue for this year is 678 million. Total expenditure, 679 million. We'll have a little bit of a shortfall estimated now, but again, that continues to be refined throughout the year in our quarterly financial reports. And then we would end the year at 63.6. And then you can see that is then the beginning balance for the next year. The 63.6 carries forward to the beginning fund balance for 21-22. Now, what's really important, I want you to pay attention to this budget shortfall line. If we do no reductions and we carry forward the shortfall from each year, you can see that we end up with, over the next 5 years, 212 million shortfall. So it's clear that we need to make a correction in reductions early on so that we can avoid that snowball effect of reductions needed. So, but remember that budget shortfall line, because that's going to come up in our scenarios. And that's the difference between the amount of money coming in and the amount of money going out. Go ahead. Next slide.
Claire, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I just checked my email and I'm realizing there are a few folks who aren't able to get onto the meeting. And so I don't know, Nicole, or whether I just tried to respond to give updated links, but is there someone else on the team that could help troubleshoot or any quick suggestions? There isn't a waiting room, is there, that they might be sort of in purgatory for? Okay. I will keep monitoring my email and see what, if I can attempt to help. I just resent the link.
They can at least see it live where it's streaming, right? So they can at least watch from the streaming part, and that's in YouTube, correct? I believe.
I'll try to work on that as well. It looks like there's no organizer for this meeting, which is the first time I've ever seen that. So I'll try to see back end.
Lisa and Brad specifically, Shanice, just as an FYI that I'm hearing from.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go forward. And I appreciate those of you that are troubleshooting in the background. And then, so we're paying attention to that budget shortfall line because that'll be important later. If you go to the next slide, please. This is the goal for fund balance that we've been following and getting to 10% by the end of 25, right? And so we are ahead of schedule on that right now. Right, at 2021, we're starting at 9% at the beginning of the year. Next slide, please. So here is scenario 1. We've got 5 scenarios. I'm going to run through this one, and then I'm going to go to the summary page because I think it's hard for us to get through this and still have time for questions. So with this, you can see that at the bottom 2 lines, that what this is spending 1% of fund balance per year. So you can see projected fund balance at 9% at the end of 2021. going down to 8, and then all the way down to 4% by the end of 2025, 26. Okay. And you can see that annual reductions needed line, the budget shortfall line at the top is where we've seen the difference between the revenue and the expenditures for the year. This would use in the first year 9.5 million or 9.6 million in fund balance. That would bring down the reductions needed to 20.7 million. We also have some things that were investments designated for SIA funding, but then at the end of the year, the budget from the legislature lowered the SIA funding and increased the state school funding. So we moved some of those strategic investments into general fund to continue them. And that's something that we did a supplemental budget at the beginning of this fiscal year to correct that. Now, what we're saying is now SIA funding is returning. So in next year, we would be able to take 7.7 million of investments that are in general fund this year and move them back to where they were originally designated into SIA funds. So then that brings our shortfall down to about 13 million for 21-22. Okay, so if you go across each, the revised shortfall line, stay on scenario 1 for a minute, please. If you go across the revised shortfall line, you can see all the way across that the first year is the biggest reduction, and then it gets down to 2.7, almost even, and then 3.3, 5.5 shortfalls, right? And so then overall, there's an $18 million shortfall if we used 1% of fund balance over those 5 years. Now, the difficulty with that is that we just had a bond sale this morning where we had excellent interest rates, which leaves us with our debt structure very really at a really low cost, which allows us to do more bond funding in the future for continuing to modernize our schools. So there's that mixed, there's reasons to hold on to fund balance. And if we would go now forward a few slides, we're going to skip the other scenarios. You'll see that they're each spelled out in the same format. If you can go back to where it said unknowns. Perfect. And say that we've got the governor's special session next week. We're going to keep our eyes on to see if anything comes out of it. There is some COVID funding, but it's not clear what it's for. I don't believe it's going to be for K-12, but we're also going to pay attention. We know the co-chair's budget is coming out in February. We know that K-12 is advocating for $9.5 billion, and that would give us another $31 million for the biennium, which would help us with our shortfall. And we also recognize there's going to be some additional costs when we return to school, especially the next 2 summers. We anticipate needing to help students accelerate their learning to recover what was lost during the pandemic. Next slide, please.
Hey, wait, Claire, I've got a question. I'm going to lower. Sure. I did the hand raise thing, but it didn't come through. On those slides where you're projecting the shortfalls, it never showed the projected state school fund contributions in those. So are the accelerating or the continuing and deepening balances in the starting the starting balances for our budget scenarios, is that essentially coming from state school funds being projected out as being lower in subsequent years on a continual basis, reflecting like no perceived economic recovery, but instead kind of flatlining? Because this is not at all overlaid with like economic projections from the state that I can see.
They are. If you go back to the revenue assumptions page, I don't mean for you to scroll right now necessarily, just keep still. If you go back into the report to the revenue assumptions, you'll see that we have the percentage growth of state school fund over those years. If you want to bring it up, that's fine. And that is showing where we're expecting recovery. So you can see that we received 4.8%, and then the next biennium we're expecting shortfall. And then when you listen to the state economist, he expects jobs to return in 23, 24. And so then we would expect then that 4% growth back again.
I see. So it's really digging into essentially our reserves in 2021, 22, and 22, 23 as being the primary drivers.
And I'll show you there's multiple options of doing that, right?
But that's the critical kind of 2-year period that we're anticipating needing massage around.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you go back to scenario 4? Here on scenario 4, this is the staff's recommendation. You'll see that there are 3 scenarios that have an overall shortfall of 26 million. And so this one actually, when you look at what you have to lose over time, there's 3 of them that end up costing the same amount over the 5-year period, but this one ends up with the highest fund balance with the same costs spread out over the 5 years. So I will show you what that looks like in the next slide. Sorry, keep going to the scenario summary. There we go. So these are all the scenarios. So let me kind of talk you through this first one. So the scenario summary 1 is the one we went into a little bit of a detail. You can see there's 18 million total overall, a shortfall, but our fund balance would be down to 4%. And that was using the 1% a year in fund balance, going from 9% to 4%, right? So let's look at scenario 2. You can see that that's also 26 million. There is, it goes 9 down to 7, and then goes back up to trying to meet the goal, and goes 8, 9, 10, right? And you can see that there's a large reduction, that bubble that occurs in 22, 23. So that would be why we wouldn't recommend that. And the next one is saying starting at 9%, using up 2% in the first year, and then staying at 7% for 2 years, and then going back up. And that costs us 34 million in loss, but gets us back up to 10%. And then the third scenario is going starting with 9% and then just holding 7% for the next 5 years. Again, that's also 26 million, but isn't smooth. It isn't as smooth as and has a lower fund balance as when you look at an 8%, starting with 9 and going to 8. It recognizes that when you take the reduction early on, that it kind of snowballs into the future years, and the reductions are much smaller. So that was our recommendation as a staff. And with that, I just want to pause for questions, because I just went through this. I spent much more time with the board describing this. And so I feel like I've given you a real condensed version, and I really want to be able to support you in learning what all this means. And I probably went so fast, it's hard to even ask the question.
I've got a question about that. So do these, shortfalls, I guess those are just gross income shortfalls. They do not incorporate any revised kind of need estimates based off of things like, boundary rebalancing that we're doing, and and staffing projections based off of that, correct?
This is current service level. So if we took what we were doing right now and carrying that forward into future years. So it doesn't have adjustments for strategic needs across the district. It does not have that built into it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Fund balance is it's your reserve. And so it's the money that you have at the end of the year that after you've received all your money in and spent all your money out. So you carry over, you start at the beginning, that's what we call it the beginning fund balance. That's how much you had left in the account at the end of the prior year. So on June 30th, we have so much left over, right? And then on July 1, that becomes our beginning fund balance for the new year. Then we count up all the revenue, all the money that comes in, and then we subtract out all the money that we spend, and then we end up with our ending fund balance. And so we're not allowed to run at a deficit mode. That's illegal. So it's really critical that we have a reserve. And so that fund balance is our reserve. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a savings account that you always want to have a few months of operations, or of money to cover your rent or your mortgage, so that you can operate if some unforeseen circumstance comes along. So an earthquake, for instance, would be an example. We'd need, if we had an earthquake in our town and we needed to still, get schools open back up, that would cost funds, and we need that reserve in order to be able to do that.
So Claire, would, in your mind, a pandemic and recovering from a pandemic qualifies in the category of reasons that would qualify us to dip into a fund balance like this, just to be clear for the group?
Yeah. So what we would, a pandemic is also an example. And what we did was we mitigated last spring we built our reserves by 20 million more, right? And to help offset the costs that we knew were coming for COVID. And then we also received some federal funding and also some state funding. So we're between those three things, those are helping us get through. So this year in 2021, we're in good shape, right? It's not the year to spend it. That's why we would go to the next year and propose using it at that point. And then what we found is if we changed our service level to match up to where our revenues actually are, and we did that early on, then we would be, there'd be minimal reductions needed in the future years with still maintaining that balance. With our bond program and the interest rates that we need to pay for bonds, it can be millions of dollars of going to interest expense rather than to projects over the years, like over the next 25 years. So this morning I sold a 25-year series of bonds that our total interest cost was less than 2% for those 25 years, right? So that is, in my career, which is a long one, that's the lowest I've ever had, right? And it's because our fund balance is up. We have good credit ratings. Just like when you have a mortgage at your house, if you have a 600 credit rating, you're going to pay a much higher interest than if you have a 750 rating, right? It's the same thing for us in our bonded debt. So that's one of the reasons, but it's also, we have to balance it out with what do our students need? And that's some of the conversation you would have heard from the board last night.
Yeah, and just to quickly pick up on that, and then I will give other folks a chance to chime in. I'm struggling isn't quite the right word, but I'm trying to reconcile these recommendations with, I think, what you just said, which is they haven't fully taken into account strategic investments we may need to make in response to the reality our students and community find themselves in, right? So things that, some of the, strategies that have the greatest, likelihood of being effective and strong evidence behind them include things we've heard about. I'm sure all of us have been talking about, high dosage tutoring, vacation academy type approaches that would help accelerate learning in the summertime. They're staff heavy, so they tend to be more expensive, but also really effective. And so I'm just trying to think about these scenarios and wrap my head around them in the context of, I think, a pretty strong and collective recognition that our kids are likely going to need additional supports beyond what we had planned prior to the pandemic, and trying to understand how those things kind of come together.
So there's a couple of things that we're we're looking at mitigating strategies this year, because this year we're doing really, we're doing okay this year. And what can we do to set aside to help us with those strategies over the summer, so that we have those dollars to spend for that. We're also looking at the federal stimulus money, conversations that are going on, and also we would earmark those stimulus dollars to go towards that learning loss and recovery during the summer. So while I think there's probably a strategy we're trying to show you financially what is a sound way to address this, but we also have to layer into it the needs from COVID. And I think that and the unanticipated resources and that are still coming, that we're still to be identified, as well as what mitigating factors can we do to save dollars this year. So there's kind of 4 things have to come together to create what we're going to do in the end.
Yep. Okay, thank you. I'll invite other voices. I'll just say one last thing, which is, Roger, I'm seeing your note, and I think probably where I'm headed sounds like a similar line of wondering that Chair Lowry and you, Director Moore talked about, and whether there is, we are being too conservative and dipping into our reserves given the sort of gravity of this moment.
Okay, now I have not been reading the chat, so if there's one that I haven't responded to, let me know.
Nope, I think no questions, more just kind of conversation happening in the background. So I think unless
Great.
you want to vocalize anything that you have written in the chat, I think we're okay.
So if there are no other questions, I rushed through it, but I wanted to give you time because I know you had other things on your agenda. We also had a quarterly financial report to show you with some benchmarking at the very back, comparison to other Oregon K-12 districts. So I just want to highlight that for you. I don't need to necessarily go over them with you, but we've been talking about benchmarking and comparing to others. And we also have now a new benchmarking tool from Council of Great City Schools for some larger districts across the country that just came out in October. So those might be something we talk about later on in this year.
This group is surprisingly quiet, so maybe I'll just sit with that silence for a minute and invite any of you to share. It doesn't necessarily even need to be a question for Claire, although we certainly should take advantage of having her here with us. But, just reactions or even basic questions. I will tell you that the first time I was hearing about some of these terms and sitting with budget information for the first time, I felt like I asked all what I categorized as dumb questions and found that most everyone else had the same question. So I really do invite and encourage everyone to jump in with questions. No question is a dumb one, and just reactions as community members, as you think about your own, student experience, the experiences of the kids in your neighborhood, just people in your world, and you think about the needs and kind of the resources we're putting to those needs. Just curious what reactions you all have.
So one further technical question that I have is I realized we went over the projections from the State School Fund. Did that also include projections from the Student Investment Act?
It does, and it's 31 million is.
I recalled that it looked like it was flat in the projections.
Yeah. Right now, that's what is expected for the next biennium. And so the corporate excise tax, they had predicted it would be lower, but it's actually recovering pretty quickly. And so we kept it flat for the following year because there's so many unknowns right now in terms of that's a brand new revenue, a new resource, and having anything to trend to is very difficult to have, especially during a pandemic.
So given that those funds are a grant as opposed to going into the general fund, and therefore a little bit harder to project like utilization on, for those reasons, are those funds, if they start going up, that we anticipate we could gear towards some of these remediation efforts that are being talked about, owing to academic regression?
Absolutely. They could be used there, or they could also continue to support the investments of our strategic plan. So either way. And certainly even, the learning recovery from post-COVID, that would also be something that would be in our plan as we go forward anyway. I mean, it's not necessarily they're separate. I would say they would align into the same work.
And I guess I'll also ask, just because nobody else is really talking, please, other people jump in. But in considering the disruption to like school attendance and suddenly shifting, more rapidly shifting enrollment than we anticipated, which we hope starts coming back, and such. Are we discussing or anticipating a change in the schedule of rollouts of the K through 8 changes?
So we have for fall of 2021, we have Kellogg opening, so we'll be filling that school. And then we have one elementary school that is out of classrooms. That's Bridger Elementary. So those two will be addressed for fall of 21, and the remaining work in the Southeast will be addressed for fall of 22. Does that kind of answer your question?
So no anticipated changes to the current schedule?
Not at this point. After we get through this spring, then we've got some Center for Black Student Excellence work happening in the Northeast. And so we're not clear on how we're going to do that work and enrollment and program balancing work. And we might need to do one, we might need to defer on the enrollment and program balancing as we're focusing on building the Center for Black Student Excellence, which actually impacts the same schools. And there's a large community engagement process involved in that. So more to come as we're working through that. So that's, I don't have specifics. I'm just identifying that we can't do both at once. Jennifer Samuels, you asked for a snapshot update of how this year's budget is going. That's what the quarterly financial report that you have on a link to your agenda today in the presentation slides. And so you can see our first quarter's projection, and then we do send those out quarterly, so you can watch it. We'll make sure that you get them each quarter as they come out.
I think I was asking if you had any additional comments about what, not just the numbers, but what is it, if you had any additional comments about it.
So in terms of this year, we're doing surprisingly well. We've had lots of additional costs, and we've had a lot of different savings. Mm-hmm. And we're coming out our fund balance is projected to be pretty close to where we started, which means we're spending and receiving revenue at about the same rate, which is excellent, because that means that helps us to mitigate future years rather than this year. So there's things like when teachers are teaching from home, there's less substitute teachers this year. The costs have gone down. There's some savings there. The first student transportation contract, we're not running all those buses every day, so that there's savings there. We're not running 50,000 computers every day, so there's electricity savings. Those are examples of savings that we're seeing this year that are helping to pay for the hand sanitizer and the plexiglass shields and things like that were and the furniture. If you've ever seen 25,000 student desks moved out of our schools into storage so that we can have social distancing, it's quite a project. and then stickers everywhere and signage everywhere, right? So preparing for COVID has a cost, but we also are realizing savings. And so far, we've been actually coming out just fine with, even all the computers we've bought, the hotspots that we've given out to families, and connectivity for every student that needs it. It's lots of expenses, but lots of savings. And so they're offsetting each other. And so far, so good. And we're coming through December, almost through the first semester. Not quite. Right, Sarah, you're correct. The families are paying the electricity. Absolutely.
It was mostly tongue in cheek as someone whose dishwasher seems to be running on a 24/7. I'm sure that is true for all of us, plus all the toys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you
If you have a teenager, you don't have to worry about lights because they sleep all day.
No.
It's like that's the key. They stay up at night when the lights are off already.
Good to know.
Key savings there. Yeah.
I'm sure there are other costs that you're picking up, though, right? Do you, sort of building off of what the question that was just asked, that Jennifer just asked, as you think about the rest of this budget year, I assume you're sort of have all these different scenarios that take into account changes in costs and expenditures based on whether or not schools reopen. And are we in a position with this year's budget and spending to date such that if, for example, schools were to open at least in some hybrid way or partially for a subset of grades, that our budget would, we wouldn't see this big influx of need to have new expenses that would outpace what we had budgeted for? That's a very inelegant way of asking the question, but hopefully that makes some sense. And I guess I'm asking regardless, if we do end up returning kids to school, do we have the budget to support it without having to dip further into our rainy day fund?
So we've been conservative in our estimates. So right now I'm not anticipating an impact. You'll see us in our quarterly financials where we're projecting our ending fund balance based on what we know for the year through June 30th. So we are right now are projecting that we'd maintain that. And of course could be some unknowns that we don't know that are going to happen at this point. But with all the things and the plans that we know, we've prepared all of our schools for reopening, right? Even if whenever that happens, if it's after the first semester, after the next quarter, if it's the beginning of next year, we have our schools prepared. Listening to our health experts, I don't know how many of you heard them on Monday night, really talking about it's going to be some time that we still need to social distance. It's not like there's going to be a magic reopening where we all go back to normal. We're going to be wearing masks and having social distancing hybrid models for quite some time. It'll take a while for all the population to have the opportunity for a vaccine. And not just a couple of months, it'll be quite some time.
One question, further question for me is I've seen reports from a number of places that folks in kind of high stress jobs, nurses, doctors, teachers, are experiencing an abnormally high rate of folks retiring, being like, this is not what I signed up for. I just can't deal with that emotionally and such. Are we seeing a larger than normal percentage of attrition amongst the teaching corps in PPS, and how, if so, how is that affecting our budgetary approach?
So right now, I would say because teachers haven't returned to a daily instruction in school, I can imagine that when that time does come, that we'll probably get some notification. And there are, I'm sure, I don't have statistics, so I don't want to just quote something because I know of a few people that have retired, right? But that's something that we could certainly look into with our HR folks and see what kind of trend they're seeing. But what for us, because the salary schedules are based on years of experience, then the costs would go down with people retiring. It does mean we lose, a huge knowledge base of, how to teach, right? So it's not something we look forward to. We really appreciate having our long-term experienced teachers who bring a lot of value into the classroom. So, but it does usually when you have retirements and your salary costs could go down. It could be that instead of growth in salary, we could get closer to flat, right? Because of that.
Speaking of retirement, it looks like Roger is disappearing into Santorini there, which I think seems like a really great place. Like he's off on the Greek Isles, checking out for the season.
So I have
wish
one
I
more.
was there.
You're right. I agree. Sorry to bring us back down to reality. Actually, I'm not going to ask my question because I see that Brad jumped in, and I think I've been taking up too much airtime. So, Brad, if you were able to come off mute and ask your question, go for it. Or Claire, if you can see the chat now,
I
you're
can
able to see that question, go for it. And Brad, so sorry that you couldn't get in. I'm not sure what happened. but
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. I know it. I know what happened. It's the whole thing with Google. They require you to sign in with one account, and so yeah, I sent in both email addresses specifically for that reason. But when this meeting got set up, it didn't have that in. So I think one of the biggest things is going to be, the only way that we're going to be able to get kids back in school, Claire, is if we're able to, get a high enough number of people that are vaccinated, and a lot of this is going to be one of the biggest discussions that's going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months. We thought masks were a big deal. Whether or not somebody has to get the vaccine is going to be 50 times. It's going to make it seem like we were just not even having a discussion. So I don't even know where to begin with this. Have negotiations begun with the teachers union to try and figure out?
Yeah, we've been in negotiations with the teachers union since this summer. We negotiated the CDL, comprehensive distance learning, that's been happening, and so that's in place. And now we're talking, about hybrid, but there is a YouTube channel that you can watch those negotiations if you're interested in how they're going and what they're discussing. Or what we're discussing, because I'm in the room. I shouldn't say they, it's we. And so right now there's not any, so the requirement of a vaccine, that's not something that I'm currently aware of any discussion at this point.
Yeah, because I honestly don't know how we reopen schools if we don't get a high enough percentage of people vaccinated, and I'm trying to figure out, and this is going to be the kind of the big thing. We have certain shots, that are required, for kids to go to school when they start. But I think I don't know how we reopen schools unless we get a high enough people, vaccinated. So if they're not having these discussions, I think.
Well, I can tell you for myself personally, I'm going to be as first in line as soon as they allow me to have it. Because I want to be able to be in schools with kids, right?
Right. Roughly 60% of the people agree with you. The problem is 40% of the people, feel the opposite. And I don't know.
Reminder, Brad, that the vaccine is not approved for children. Like none of them are.
And that's the other
we can't
thing.
even require it for children at this point. So requiring it for teachers is one of those.
Yeah, I'm not talking about it for kids. I'm just talking about it for teachers. I don't know how we reopen schools unless you start, and I think that's a discussion that's going to have to start. So,
and I think it, that For myself, it's, I would choose to just go and get it. And it's not, I don't even know what is the possibilities there. For me, personally, I would want it to be an individual's choice on whether they receive the vaccine or not. And so, and I do think many of our teachers are anxious to get back in the classroom with our kids to really get them back into the learning mode that's so much more impactful when they're in the same room. Sarah, I think you're muted.
I was mostly talking to my friend who's joined me.
Okay.
Telling her that I was coming off mute, so maybe to be nice and quiet. We'll see how that goes. So we have just about 5 minutes left, which we can use to continue the conversation. There's only one more agenda item, which was to talk about the calendar of meetings for next year, which, to be quite honest, myself and my co-chairs, despite best efforts so far, have not been able to sort of convene the people that we need to have some conversations about some adjustments to that calendar. If you recall, we talked briefly about this at our first meeting. The draft calendar that you all have and the dates that have been publicized only include one joint sort of working session between CBRC and the board, which I think we had all discussed and felt like maybe wasn't aligned with our goals this year around closer collaboration and alignment. And so I think we are still, I think we're hopeful that I don't know if it'll happen before the holiday, but sometime in the next couple of weeks that we'll be able to sit down with Director Moore and other folks to try and identify some additional opportunities for us to meet together, which would mean that our calendar would change. But right now the current calendar has us meeting next in, I think, January 14th, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have a February meeting, and I think also have a joint, I can't remember if it's February or March. I had it up a second ago, but there's a joint session proposed somewhere in there. So January 14th, we have another February 11th meeting, and then a tentative joint session on March 9th. And so I think our goal is to try and get a joint meeting or working session on the books sooner than March, given the budget cycle. So Judah, Irina, Parker, I don't know if you all want to chime in, Director Moore, with any comments, but I don't know that we have much more discussion or updates to share on additional or on the calendar at this point in time.
I want to propose we move the February 11th one to the 14th again. When we had the Valentine's Day meeting before, and people brought candy and commiserated about having the stare down with their partners and such, I thought that was really lovely and a bonding experience that we should share again. It's like, no, I love you, honey, but I'm totally ditching you for a committee meeting. Everyone should have that experience.
Okay, so why don't I think for the sake of today, we will probably just have to agree to follow up. Judah, we'll take your suggestion into consideration.
Where are you, Mommy?
I think we've all spent sufficient time with our loved ones at this point. So if we could not have a holiday, that would probably, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I'd be okay with it. Okay, hold on. I'm right up here in the tiny corner. Okay. Okay. Oh, she wants to show you her picture. Okay, great. Morgana. Okay, nice and quiet.
I like those birds. Good job.
Thank you.
Those are well done.
So I think what we'll do is to have a couple quick conversations with a few folks and maybe send out some proposed new dates that reflect more collaborative opportunities, as well as potentially that February 14th holiday. But we'll make sure you all know about that as early as possible in the new year. But for now, I would plan on our next meeting being January 14th and having some additional opportunities to collaborate and meet jointly with the board. Any final questions, things we didn't get to tonight that you were hoping to? Going once, going twice. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate taking the time, Claire and Nicole and the other PPS staff folks, Shanice, et cetera. Really appreciate you all being with and making time for this. And we will look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. Meanwhile, I hope you all are able to close your computers, stay off of Zoom, unless it's for family connectivity purposes, and just sort of rest and recharge. 2020 has been a year, and I just hope you're all able to find some joy in what is a very unusual, to say the least, holiday season.
See you next year.
Thanks, everyone.